Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and welcome to my tier list of the 10 Battle for Azeroth dungeons in Mythic Plus. So, obviously this is a little bit of a more qualitative tier list than some of my spec tier lists have been. I'm going to try and rate these dungeons based on how well designed I think they are for Mythic Plus in particular, so how much of a good Mythic Plus dungeon they are. So let's start off in the F tier. The F tier is where I'm going to place dungeons that I think have very, very serious problems that have gone unresolved for a long time in Mythic Plus. The first dungeon that I want to put here is King's Rest. King's Rest has been overtuned for more than a year now in Mythic Plus. It's very hard to see. There are basically never runs of King's Rest done at the same level as the other dungeons. Recently, it's been possible to do it on Fortified, because you could actually skip Shadow of Zul, but before that was possible, before we learned how to do that, and presumably once they fix that bug, King's Rest is just going to be this dungeon where on Fortified, Shadow of Zul just makes it so that you can't do the dungeon at the same level as you can do other dungeons, and on Tyrannical, the bosses are really, really hard. There's just numerous overtuned abilities throughout the dungeon. So Spit Gold, which has been nerfed, I think, multiple times, Severing Axe, the bleeds from the Berserkers, Shadow of Zul, and just the overall damage throughout the dungeon is higher than in most of the other dungeons. And it's a linear dungeon, so there's just one path to go down from the front to the end, which means there's not really many options for you to pull different things and make a cool route. You basically just always pull the mobs that are directly in front of you, and you can basically never pull more than one group at once because that's very lethal to do. Like, you'll see it in MDI where teams are able to pull the whole first room at once because it's a slightly lower key and because they practiced it for weeks on end, and they have a very specific composition that allows them to do that, and they're committing all their cooldowns to it. But in a live key setting, you're basically never able to pull more than one pull at a time because there's always some lethal mob in each pull, and you can't have more than one of those usually. Also in the F tier, Siege of Borealis. Siege of Borealis is a dungeon that I think is pretty poorly designed. There's a number of factors that I really don't like about Siege of Borealis. One is it's hugely imbalanced between Alliance and Horde. Alliance just have a dramatically harder starting area of the dungeon. They randomly have to wait 30 seconds before the last boss becomes attackable, because there's some roleplay that they get that Horde doesn't get. So that's a pretty big drawback to me. I think that sort of faction-based asymmetry, it's cool for flavor reasons, should probably be absent from Mythic Plus. From Mythic Plus, at the very least, you should be able to choose which of the dungeon routes you do and be able to do it regardless of which faction you are. I'm not sure. There should be something other than the way it is now. That it's, I think, pretty silly that Alliance has such a harder version of the dungeon. Also, Siege of Borealis has weird interactions with a bunch of different affixes. There's just like Bolstering, Sanguine just make the place way harder than most other dungeons because there's all these little mobs that just on-death affixes are really painful on. So, Kultiran Footman and Scrim something, I actually forget their name, Gutters, the little mobs that die instantly. Those mobs triggering on death affixes can be really annoying, and Bolstering Siege in particular, there's like many pulls where it is just a huge problem that there's not obvious counterplay to, and I don't like dungeons where there's not obvious counterplay to affixes, or at least, even if there's not obvious counterplay, I wish there was more options for how to deal with Bolstering Siege, for instance. Bolstering Siege, you're basically the best plan is to bolster a spotter to be like a raid boss and then use it to kill the whole dungeon. And I don't think that's particularly interesting dungeon design. That's just kind of one silly tactic that you use to get around how awful the dungeon is in every other way for bolstering. All right, the final F tier dungeon here is Toldagor. Toldagor has a lot of good things going for it, but there are big structural problems with the dungeon that I think keep it down here. So one thing that's wrong with Toldagor is that just stuff randomly pulls through the walls and through the floors all the time. If you ever press Ring of Peace or Typhoon in this dungeon, there's a good chance that the mob is going to take an adventure downstairs for some reason. It's just going to get knocked through the floor and, pull the whole bottom of the dungeon to come and find you. There's random abilities like Null Barrier, Brewmaster, Hot Trub, Echoing Blades from Assassination Robe, just a bunch of random abilities pull through the wall in this place, and that is really annoying because there's thin walls and thin floors everywhere. If you have nameplates turned on in this place, you just see, a bunch of nameplates from the floor below you. So this would have been pretty easily fixed if they just made the floors a little bit higher, like a little bit more distance between each floor. That would have been a good way to solve a lot of these problems kind of automatically in this dungeon. The Cannon Gauntlet area of Toldagor is also something that I don't think is particularly good. It used to be a lot worse competitively when you would just skip to the cannon area and then have unlimited cannon shots. But now that the cannons have been limited down to 5, it's a little bit better. It's a little bit more interesting, I'd say. from like a competitive perspective, but I still think that it's not particularly like the way to play the cannon area is just to pull as much as you can and then kill it in a cannon barrage. And I don't think that actually like I don't think that the most interesting way to play a dungeon is for you to hop in a cannon and press one button 4 times to kill a bunch of mobs. I don't think that's actually good Mythic Plus dungeon design. So for those reasons, I'm putting Toldagor down in the F tier. There are also some bosses that are kind of unfun in Toldagor with certain affix combos. I'm looking at like Tyrannical Overseer Korgus. There's an RNG component to that fight where just randomly sometimes he's going to do explosive bursts way more frequently than other times. And those types of combinations, we call those doubles. If you're ever watching a high-level Toldagor stream and you're like, what are these doubles they're talking about? That's when he casts explosive bursts way more often, and that can be that makes the HPS requirement on that fight like 3 times as high, which is very silly. So that sort of boss RNG I think is also bad. All right, up in the D tier, we have dungeons that are less horrifically plagued with issues. One dungeon here is Shrine of the Storm. Shrine of the Storm is a dungeon that a lot of people really hate. It has some nice things going for it. I like the healer buff damage interaction on the last boss. I think that's cool. I think a lot of healers really like, pumping damage on the last boss. I think that's a nice thing for a dungeon to have. But Shrine of the Storm is kind of... Okay, my biggest problem with Shrine of the Storm is the graveyard not updating. You kill the first boss, your graveyard doesn't update. You kill the second boss, your graveyard doesn't update. You die before the third boss, and your run back is something like okay, Method NA wiped there, and that's like an MDI caliber team, and it still took them 5 minutes to get back to where they were. And if you're like a live team, and you've just got all these mobs that you've skipped between you and where you died, there's just no way to get back there at all reasonably. Shrine of the Storm is just this dungeon where randomly, if you wipe in the first half of the dungeon, often everybody's just going to hearth. They're just not going to bother trying to get back there and redo all the skips that you skipped and get past all the mobs that you got past. So that is actually something that takes many points away from Shrine of the Storm for me. It's one of the reasons that I think groups often don't like doing Shrine of the Storm is just how unfriendly it is to a wipe. King's Rest also has a similar problem there, by the way, that I didn't mention when I was talking about that. That is a huge anchor weighing down Shrine of the Storm. Outside of that, Shrine of the Storm, not too bad. There are some annoying, pulls and bosses. But for me, actually, really, now that I think about it, really that graveyard thing is the biggest issue with Shrine of the Storm. And I think enough to keep it down in the D tier. Also in the D tier, Temple of Sithralis. Temple of Sithralis, there's a lot of things that I like about this dungeon, but it's extremely linear. There's very little options to do interesting, pulls in Temple. It's pretty much set out for you. There are very few places to be creative with how you're going to attack the dungeon because there's pretty much, like if you go off the beaten path and pull extra stuff, it's hard to come up with, a way that doesn't end up with you being over 100% count. There are a couple of things that, like the fact that you just always fight the last boss and then while you're empowered, you pull the trash behind you and get to 100% that way. I don't think that was particularly... I kind of wish that they made that not work because I think that actually reduces the amount of decisions available to you when you're looking at the dungeon and trying to come up with what path you want to do. And the bosses I feel like are a little bit overtuned here, especially the first and third boss in particular. I think that those really make the dungeon focused. Like many times when you go into Tyrannical Temple of Sithralis, it's just a very binary question of can we defeat the third boss? If yes, we're going to time the key. If no, we are going to hearth out and not bother, or we're going to wait 10 minutes for our bloodlust and then we'll do it again, and then we'll finish the dungeon and deplete it, whatever. So I don't think I think that the dungeon does not have very much depth or more going on to it than I don't think it has a full dungeon's worth of interesting choices associated with it. All right, up in the C tier, I'm going to place the Mother Lode. The Mother Lode is a dungeon that is big, wide open, and you have a lot of options for what trash you want to pull in the dungeon. I think that's a cool thing going for it. Unfortunately, as much as there's theoretically a lot of options, the difference between how efficient it is to clear, mechanized Peacekeeper pulls in the early dungeon, which happen to give a lot of extra enemy forces count, versus pulling stuff like the Research and Development wing later in the dungeon. You basically never see groups pull the R&D wing because that is just way worse than pulling the start of the dungeon. So unfortunately, even though it's got a lot of potential to be somewhere where you can do a lot of different routes that involve, skipping different parts of the dungeon, in practice, most groups end up skipping the same part of the dungeon every time, which is the R&D wing and the later half of the, VMZ or whatever it is right before the last boss. So that is a drawback for the dungeon. The dungeon also not great with a couple of specific affixes, sort of like Siege of Borealis, Bolstering, Sanguine, and even Fortified, just those affixes. Whenever any of those 3 affixes is active, it's a pretty rough Mother Lode week. And that, I think dungeons that are particularly bad on a few affixes, I think that is a drawback for the dungeon design. Mother Lode, though, I think does have a lot of interesting trash, a couple interesting bosses, and so I think that it deserves better than the other dungeons that we talked about so far, so I'm putting it up in the C tier. Also in the C tier, Crest Manor. Crest Manor has a lot of cool pulls. There's a lot of interesting, maybe we should pull this weird mini-boss, maybe we shouldn't, maybe we should pull this trash pack, maybe we shouldn't. There are huge RNG components to the dungeon that I don't like, though. Getting a random door assigned to you at the start of the run, I think, is pretty obnoxious for Mythic Plus. I don't like, going into a dungeon and not knowing what way I'm going to go. It means that, there's a lot. You basically have to practice 3 times as many Waycrest, routes and options as you do for other dungeons because of how different each of those doorways makes the dungeon. And there are these spots where you can spawn a witch, and randomly that witch can be a Rune Weaver, which is not so bad at all, a Soul Charmer, which, you should kick the volleys on and move for the candles, but again, not too bad, or a Vine Twister, which randomly trucks your tank for way more damage, and casts Grasping Thorns every, 10 seconds, that really needs to be interrupted, or else bad things start happening. So just that RNG component, every time you spawn a witch, it could be a Vine Twister, and that could really change how big you can pull, I think is not a good thing for a dungeon to have. I don't think that there should be that level of randomness in a Mythic Plus dungeon. So that is holding Waycrest down in the C tier for me. Okay, up in the B tier, Untitled. Untitled has a lot of similar problems to some of the earlier dungeons we talked about. There are some pulls that are really nasty and just never get pulled, like a double Honor Guard pull before Volcall that has never, in the history of World of Warcraft, been pulled by a serious group. But the thing that kind of saves Untitled and brings it up to the B tier is just how wide open and how much optionality there is to the dungeon. You can go Razan first, you can jump down to Razan at various times throughout the dungeon, you can do the middle pull, you can skip the middle pull, you can go get some extra trash from the left or right sides of the dungeon if you just want some extra count, and then go the other way. You can do big skips to either boss on either side. You can do, Yasma first, Volcall first. There's all kinds of options there, so that big extra optionality, letting you choose what to do, really makes a lot of interesting route-making decisions for Untitled, and I think that brings it up to the B tier. I think it's just so cool that, it's still not been really fully solved what exactly the best way to pull Untitled is. All right, up in the A tier, Freehold. Now, I'm trying to keep this tier list from just being like a top, the top tier dungeons are the easiest ones and the bottom are the hardest ones. But it turns out that some of the easier dungeons, I think, are also just better designed. Freehold does have some big problems with it that are holding it back from being like an S-tier dungeon. But most of Freehold I really like. I really like how wide open the dungeon is. I like how you can choose to go, at various times in BFA's history, the meta has been to kill Trothak, and then Harlan, and then the Council of Captains, or maybe kill Harlan, and then the Council of Captains, and then Trothak. There's all kinds of weird ways that you can do those last 3 bosses in pretty much any order, because there's this mechanic where you join the crew, and that means that you can then pull a certain boss, but some of the trash goes away, and that might be bad because you might want it for mob count, or maybe that means that you can then double pull some extra packs because there's fewer mobs in each of them. So maybe you use it to remove certain enemies. You want to go pull some packs that have, easy to kill Cutwater enemies, and then you go remove the Cutwater Harpooners and come back and do pulls that would have included those. I think that's really cool, and that kind of really expands the decision tree when looking at the dungeon. There are some bosses that are problematic in here. Eudora and Skycap and Crag are very one-shotty on High Tyrannical. There are ways to play around this, but usually it involves just camping out by a line of sight spot, and I don't think that I don't mind a little bit of that in dungeons, but I think it holds it back from being truly an S-tier dungeon. Freehold also a dungeon that has been a little bugged at various times in BFA's history. For a couple months, there was a way to not fight Ludwig or do the pig event. They fixed that eventually. Sometimes the sharks randomly bug out, and we've seen that actually in MDI even be a big problem. So, not a perfect dungeon for that reason. I'm not sure that the Ravager mechanic at the end of the dungeon is all that great either, where you just have the Ravagers instantly kill themselves and 2 nearby friends. I don't think that there may be a way where that kind of mechanic would be more fun, but I think in practice it ends up being mostly not super great gameplay at the end of the dungeon there. So those are things that I think hold Freehold back from being a S-tier dungeon, but otherwise I really like everything else going on in that place. And my favorite dungeon in BFA, the Underrot. Also only in the A tier. I'm not willing to call this one an S tier dungeon either. I don't think we really hit any of those in BFA up in the S tier. But the Underrot has a lot of things that I really like going on there. You know how a lot of these earlier dungeons we were talking about how there are certain affixes that are really unfair on them? The Underrot is a dungeon where it feels really well balanced on any affix week. It feels like every affix is impactful there. Even some affixes like Volcanic that aren't normally hard are actually pretty hard on the last boss of Underrot. And then a lot of the affixes that turn off certain dungeons don't turn off the Underrot. You'll feel affixes like Raging or Explosive or Bolstering or whatever in the Underrot, like those matter, but they don't stop you from going in there. They're not prohibitive, so a really great dungeon for Mythic Plus. From that perspective, any dungeon that like I am happy to play on any week, but is not free on any week, I think is a great place to be. I think the bosses are fairly interesting, although the bosses are, I think, the thing holding it back from S tier. The first boss, just a boss about interrupting stuff, and there's not really anything else going on, not really any other damage happening to the group. It's kind of whatever. The second boss feels like the tantrum mechanic is a little bit too much damage going out on that one, and also they start coming very frequently as the fight goes on, and that, I think, makes it pretty boring. You're just kind of, like, you only get to do your damage for like 10 seconds, and then you're back to soaking ticks again and running around the room, and I don't think that is super duper fun. The last two bosses, though, I think are pretty good in the Underrot. And a lot of the trash is interesting. There's a lot of interesting options. Like, it looks like a pretty linear dungeon in that there's just a straight line route that you go between the bosses, but there's actually a lot of options with what you want to pull each week. There are some random sets of trash that they put in the dungeon that are not realistic to pull, but outside of a few, there's pretty big options about what you do want to pull. And many groups have come up with different answers for, like, do we want to pull this Triple Lasher pack? Do we want to pull this Befouled Spirit pack? Do we want to pull these worms, or do we want to skip them? Are we comfortable pulling, like, a Defiler and a Death Speaker at the same time? These sorts of questions are really cool, and I think that Underrot is a great place for, like, it has a lot of cool options for route design. Most of the pulls are interesting, and is good to play on any week. So that's why it's my favorite BFA dungeon. Hope you've enjoyed this little tier list video that I've made here. Let me know what you think of, me doing more of these tier list videos for this kind of content. I'm going to make one for affixes as well, so stay tuned for that. Check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/ratnos, where I play this video game also. Remember to subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and press like if you liked the video also. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.